Donald Trump is still determined to push Ukraine to the limit so that Ukraine has no choice but to give in, which would of course make it much easier to achieve the peace Trump promised. A peace where all the strain falls on Kyiv, as if the Ukrainians themselves were to blame for the Russian invasion. And so, after discussions with Zelenskyy in the Oval Office, Washington has now taken a drastic step, suspending all US military aid to Ukraine, including that already committed by the Biden administration that was in the process of being sent until Zelenskyy bends the knee. In other words, until further notice, supply of all American weapons with which Kyiv defends itself against the Russian invasion is paused.
Trump pauses military aid to Ukraine after clash with Zelenskyy.
And not only that, it seems that all non-military collaboration is also stopped. For example, the sharing of data collected by US intelligence. According to the Trump administration, aid will only be restored when Ukraine's leaders demonstrate a good faith commitment to peace. And remember, this comes verbatim from a senior US official. We've already told you that with Trump, tyrants always do well. Let's just say that this White House has made it very clear. It's much easier to put pressure on the victim than on the aggressor. Well, things have become so complicated for the Ukrainians that, yes, it's clear that they need US military assistance, so much so that Zelenskyy had to issue a statement yesterday saying this.
Our meeting in Washington at the White House on Friday did not go the way it was supposed to be. It is regrettable that it happened this way. It is time to make things right. We would like future cooperation and communication to be constructive.
Since last Friday, when the monumental row broke out in the Oval Office, Donald Trump and J.D. Vance have been demanding that Zelenskyy apologize and ask for forgiveness. The truth, we're not sure what he has to apologize for. Zelenskyy not only didn't start the dispute, but was the victim of a standoff where they tried to treat him like a wimp and force him to fully accept Trump's position in front of the cameras. But none of that matters. The situation is what it is. And with this post on X, the social media platform, the Ukrainian president has sought to calm the waters. He doesn't accept guilt, nor does he strictly ask for forgiveness, but he recognizes that the situation was regrettable, which is indeed a fact. It was regrettable. Be that as it may, the fact is that shortly after, and I'm referring to minutes, not hours, this news broke.
US and Ukraine prepare to sign minerals deal on Tuesday, sources say.
In the end, it seems that there will be a signing of the so-called Ukraine Minerals Agreement, a signing that should have taken place last Friday, but due to the verbal sparring and the lack of security guarantees, ended up falling apart. So now we have two questions. Precisely what does this agreement consist of? And secondly, what is the Ukrainian president exchanging in the hopes of signing this agreement? Well, let's start with the first one. And I'm sorry to say, but there's a lot of hype here. We've already told you about it. What appears to be up for signing is essentially a memorandum of understanding, an agreement whereby the parties commit to a fund to which half of the returns generated by new natural resource exploitation projects will go to the government. This fund would then use these resources to invest in Ukraine and probably also to buy weapons. However, let me stress, it's a memorandum of understanding, a cooperation agreement between governments, and little more. From that point on, all the details still need to be negotiated and finalized. And of course, it will ultimately be the private sector that will have to make the investments to exploit all these natural resources, which, by the way, will take a lot of time. Keep in mind that putting large mining operations into action can take more than a decade. In fact, there's not even an up-to-date mapping of Ukraine's actual natural resources. The existing one dates back to the Soviet era and is very limited, so the truth is that it's not even known for sure how commercially viable Ukraine's deposits of critical minerals, such as rare earths, are. In fact, do you know that there are experts who are very skeptical about this whole story? Take a look, for example, at the strong conclusion of the well-known Bloomberg analyst Javier Blas.
To the best of my knowledge, Ukraine has no significant rare earth deposits other than small scandium mines. At best, the value of all the world's rare earth production rounds to $15 billion a year. Emphasis on a year. That's equal to the value of just 2 days of global oil output. Even if Ukraine had gigantic deposits, they wouldn't be that valuable in geoeconomic terms.
But okay, apart from rare earths, the truth is that Ukraine does have many other critical minerals, such as gallium and titanium. There's little doubt about that. The problem, once again, is that the geological mappings are not up to date. So it's not known for certain what reserves we're talking about, or whether or not they are viable. And it's no longer just a matter of setting up the mines and all the infrastructure that these operations require. It's that all the geological research will have to be done first. In other words, this is going to take even longer. So what does all this mean? Well, that basically we are dealing with an agreement that seeks to lay a foundation that will facilitate long-term investment in Ukraine, but little more. What happens and how the development of this collaboration is defined most likely won't be up to this administration. So in reality, we're looking at a big marketing operation so that Trump can say something like, "We spent money in Ukraine, but thanks to me, in return, we'll receive a lot of resources and money." This is not true, but whatever. That's the way things work in Washington these days. In fact, guess what? This isn't the first time Trump has done something like this. Check out this news item from 2017.
Trump, Ghani agree U.S. can help develop Afghanistan's rare earth minerals.
Okay, it's true that at that time, it was not as concrete as it is now in Ukraine, but the story was to some extent similar. And do you know what happened? 2 years later, Trump signed an agreement with the Taliban, whereby the US de facto handed over the country to them. And I repeat, I know things are more developed this time, but we're still talking about little more than a memorandum of understanding that Trump wants to frame as a major political victory. Which brings us directly to the second question. In exchange for what is Zelenskyy going to agree to sign an agreement that ties the exploitation of Ukraine's national resources to the United States? Well, basically, to prevent the freezing of military aid and to keep it flowing. Aid that includes critical munitions, hundreds of multiple launch-guided rocket systems, anti-tank weapons, and anti-aircraft defenses, among many other things. Keep in mind that Ukraine has a heavy dependence on the United States for its air defense, basically because only US Patriot anti-missile systems are capable of shooting down some of the types of ballistic missiles that Russia launches daily against Ukraine. VisualPolitik community, the idea is already more than clear. Basically, if Zelenskyy doesn't sign, then Kyiv will have problems defending their cities from Russian missiles falling on Ukrainian civilians while they're sleeping in their homes. But if you sign without security guarantees, in reality, what you would be doing is giving Trump a victory while leaving Ukraine exposed to the Russians, attempting another invasion in a few years. Because don't forget that this war started because Vladimir Putin believes that Ukraine does not exist and should belong to Russia. That explains why Zelenskyy is so insistent on security guarantees, because without them, what Trump is demanding of them is a surrender without guarantees of any kind, so that Washington can score a point in ending the war. Therein lies the problem. It's not that Zelenskyy doesn't want peace, as the Kremlin propagandists on both sides of the Atlantic keep crowing. The problem is that he knows that with Russia, a mere agreement is a dead letter. And the famous minerals deal is somewhat political for Trump, but means little or nothing for Ukraine's future security. Do you understand the game now? Zelenskyy knows that the minerals deal with Trump is worthless, guarantees nothing, and on top of that, don't forget that it comes from a president who is not entirely trustworthy either. Not only because his stay in the White House is limited, but because look at what he's done with Canada and Mexico. In 2019, he imposed on them the renegotiation of NAFTA to sign a new trade agreement. Trump signed it, and now just a few years later, he's burnt it with tariffs. Crazy. But of course, Zelenskyy probably has no choice but to sign this agreement, at least so that US military aid is not completely cut off. As I said, it's easier to try to make the victim give in than to get serious with the bully, which in this case is Vladimir Putin, who, by the way, must be overjoyed. Of course, those who aren't so happy are the European leaders. Instead, they are stunned and very, very worried. So reactions have not been long in coming. Trump's actions in recent days have caused so much outrage in Europe that even important leaders of the so-called alt-right, who are ideologically close to Trump, have said things like this.
Marine Le Pen condemns the brutality of the United States' decision to suspend aid to Ukraine. The breakdown in talks and aid between the US and Ukraine only helps Putin. I hope that Keir Starmer can use his new role to bring the two together and soon.
VisualPolitik community, the reality check is historic. Without going any further, Farage is a guy who, although at odds with Elon Musk, is a friend of Trump. He was even at the Mar-a-Lago on 5th of November last year to follow the election results alongside the president's. He's not exactly one of those woke people that some people love to talk about. Although, who knows? Maybe now Le Pen and Farage have also become progressives. Who can say? Joking aside, the point is that Trump is hitting smack after smack at everything that smells of Ukraine and Europe, and that's why many political leaders, even those who spent years supporting him in everything, are starting to disassociate themselves. Although the same cannot be said of others. Am I right, Viktor Orban? Santiago Abascal? And what is happening in the last few hours is not even limited to the confrontation with Ukraine. At the same time, things like this are happening. Take a look.
White House seeks plan for possible Russia sanctions relief, sources say.
Just as you heard, all indications are that Washington is working on a plan to lift economic sanctions against Russia, both those affecting the country itself and those targeting oligarchs close to Putin. According to Reuters sources, the Trump administration has asked the State and Treasury departments to draft a list of sanctions that could be eased so that US officials can discuss with Russian representatives in the coming days. In fact, this would be part of the talks they are having with Moscow to improve their relations.
The new administration is rapidly changing all foreign policy configurations. This largely aligns with our vision.
It's not yet clear which sanctions would be lifted first, but Trump could issue an executive order to begin the process of, how should I put it, of easing and relief. Nevertheless, lifting the measures on certain entities would need congressional approval. And what is Trump asking for in return? Well, it seems we have to start looking at Iran.
Putin agrees to help Trump broker nuclear talks with Iran.
Putin becoming a go-between for the White House. Did you see this one coming? Trump not only wants to score points for the peace in Ukraine, he also wants to score more political goals. For example, an agreement with the Ayatollahs. And not only that, remember that not so many weeks ago, Trump already announced that he wanted to resume talks with Kim Jong-un, another scenario in which Putin could help him. So what's the problem with all this? Well, the problem is that to get what he wants, Trump seems willing to sell out Ukraine and all of Europe. Not only that, but his track record tells us that with Trump, tyrants always get their way. For example, he made peace with the Taliban in exchange for handing over Afghanistan to them, and now he seems to want to do something very similar in Ukraine. And naturally, having Putin as an intermediary is not very reassuring either. Well, be that as it may, this is the new era of Trump. A new era that is frightening, and very much so for half of the world, particularly Europe. In fact, just a few hours ago, this news came out.
Von der Leyen put forward the €150 billion fund for priorities such as air defense, missiles, and drones as part of a package of proposals that she said could mobilize up to €800 billion for European defense.
We're going to talk about all this rearmament of Europe in more detail in another video here on VisualPolitik. Because if one thing is clear, is that the old continent is already on the move. Whether it's too much or too little, whether enough or not, we'll be talking about it. But the messages are becoming very clear. Europe no longer trusts Washington. Do you remember the words of Kaja Kallas, the EU's High Representative for Foreign Policy? A few days ago, following the row in the Oval Office, she said this.
Today it has become clear that the free world needs a new leader. It is up to us Europeans to accept this challenge.
Now even France has offered to create a nuclear umbrella with its own nuclear bombs to protect the whole of Europe, something that has never before been considered in such a direct way.
Macron to discuss nuclear deterrence with European allies.
And not only that, at the same time, the UK is moving to discuss putting a European peacekeeping force in Ukraine once the war is over. Prime Minister Starmer wants a coalition of European countries to put some 30,000 troops in Ukraine on a peacekeeping mission once a peace, armistice, or whatever comes out of all this chaos has been signed.
Starmer, I am ready and willing to put British troops in Ukraine.
This headline is strong, very strong. And take note, he is not alone in this. France also looks favourably on this coalition. But of course, this proposal has evoked reactions of all kinds. Some European countries have taken a stand against it, while others, the majority, have remained silent.
Germany to reject Starmer's plan for troops in Ukraine as Europe splits over peace deal. Poland won't send troops to Ukraine, Tusk announces.
The question is, who's right? The British and the French, or the Germans and the Poles? Let's see. We've told you many times on VisualPolitik, and also Zelenskyy himself has said it. Ukraine has the largest military in Europe right now. According to the Ukrainian president, his country currently has 980,000 active troops, making the Ukrainian armed forces by far the largest by size on the entire continent. To give you an idea, the next European country on that list with the most active soldiers is France, with just over 200,000 troops. That is barely a fifth of the size. On top of that, the Ukrainians have a lot of combat experience, which has made us ask us a question or two, such as, for instance, does Ukraine really need 30,000 European soldiers after the end of the war when they have almost 1 million in service? Yes, this is something Zelenskyy himself is also asking for. But does this make sense? Are there no other ways to ensure Ukraine's security after the war? Well, this is precisely what we're going to talk about next. Stay tuned. The
next dilemma.
Peacekeepers, yes. Peacekeepers, no. This is going to be a dilemma, a debate that may soon dominate all European headlines. And as we've just told you, there's a lot of division among the major European powers over the idea of sending troops to Ukraine once the war is over. But could this be some kind of meaningless trap? Well, let's see. To begin with, let's be clear that the number of European soldiers that would arrive in Ukraine would not be nearly enough to effectively deter Russia. In fact, while Starmer and Macron are talking about 30,000, Zelenskyy calls for around 150,000, so that, in his opinion, they can really fulfill some kind of deterrent role. What's more, most experts agree with the Ukrainian president that the proposal currently under discussion is insufficient. But then, why do London and Paris pose such an understaffed scenario? Well, for starters, the UK and France know that they will have very little support to carry out this plan, so the less support, the less ambition with the numbers. If Germany and Poland, two of Europe's major military powers, refuse to participate in this, it would be impossible to reach the figures requested by Zelenskyy. The plan would be dead, or simply rickety, merely cosmetic. But aside from the question of how big this force might be, there is another question that is even more important. Is this really necessary? Well, I'm sorry to say it, but it's probably not necessary. It may even be counterproductive. I mean, it's true that Washington is no longer a reliable partner for guaranteeing security anywhere in Europe, and that measures that would have been unthinkable before must be put on the table. But not just any measure. This cannot be about sending troops just for the sake of it, but about supporting Ukraine even more. In other words, the key is to increase the deterrent power of Kyiv and the whole of Europe for the post-war period. But how can this be done? Essentially, by strengthening Europe's arms industry. It will come as no surprise if we tell you that the European arms industry is on the back foot. Compared to the US and Chinese industries, it is clearly at the bottom of the list. And one of the most serious problems is that each country wants to favor its own companies under the mantra of sovereignty and creating local jobs. What's more, long-term contracts are conspicuous by their absence, and production is more fragmented than a 10,000-piece jigsaw puzzle. The result? We have an industry that, to this day, cannot even dream of matching the production capacity and technological level of the US industry. But watch out, because something is changing. In recent years, Europe seems to be waking up from its lethargy, and now even Ursula von der Leyen herself has made it clear. Reviving the arms industry on the European continent is a priority, and this is not a whim. It's an urgent necessity for sustaining the Ukrainian deterrence. Europe needs to arm its armies, expand and replenish its rundown arsenals, and, of course, maintain support for Ukraine and all European countries bordering Russia or Belarus. And let's see, in a way, it's something that is already being done. In recent years, the military budget of European countries has grown strongly, and in Ukraine, while Kyiv does spend about $6 billion on weapons, they produce more than $20 billion worth of them. How is this possible? Well, naturally, thanks to European collaboration, both at the level of governments and private companies. For example, Romania is cooperating with Ukraine to develop the P-360 Neptune anti-ship missile, Lithuania to create the new Palyanitisia missile, and Slovakia to produce the ACS-3 long-range drone. And these are just a few examples. There are many more. But of course, this effort needs to be multiplied. And do you know what this means? That for Ukraine, this bet on rearming at all costs and financing Ukraine's own military industry is actually much better than any troop deployment. And it would certainly be more convenient for Europe as well. It would develop a powerful industry, guarantee its long-term security, and reduce the risk of a direct confrontation with Russia. In other words, spend the money where it's needed instead of sending a handful of soldiers to Ukraine with little ability to do anything. Imagine for a moment this scenario. Europe steps forward. Its soldiers set foot in Ukraine and deploy at strategic points. The message seems clear. But would that guarantee the security of the continent? Would it be enough to stop Putin in the long term? Or would we only be buying time while the underlying problems remain intact? Well, no, not really. Because the key is not what a war-weary Russia can do today, but what it will be able to do 5 or 10 years from now. Before sending a message with troops, Europe needs to really armor itself. So instead of sending troops on a trip, spend on factories, equipment, ammunition, reserves, and well-trained troops. In fact, more could still be done. Europe should be prepared not on Ukrainian soil, but along the entire border with Russia.
For example, Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania have seen a doubling of Allied troop presence under NATO in recent years. Now, it would not be unreasonable to consider European initiatives of this type that would be parallel to NATO and would not require the assistance or support of the United States. NATO's entire eastern border could be consolidated as a highly militarized zone with reinforced bases, advanced air defense, and troops ready to act in case of need. And that needs to be supported by European Union funds.
And you know what? Ukraine should be part of this new European security structure. Come to think of it, the Ukrainians, as we've told you, have a number of soldiers and senior commanders with combat experience who could be of great use in helping to secure the Eastern European border. Perhaps in not too long a period of time with sufficient funding, they could contribute more than the US soldiers that are currently deployed on the old continent. And keep in mind, this is not a crazy idea that we came up with overnight. Ukraine might be willing to do so in exchange for several things. First, money for its reconstruction. Second, a constant flow of European arms to ensure its military deterrence against Russia. Third, mutual security guarantees at the European level in the purest NATO style. And fourth, a solid guarantee of accession to the European Union within a reasonable period of time. It would be a win-win deal for both sides, and the Ukrainian Prime Minister seems to be very clear about that. This is what he himself wrote just 3 weeks ago in Politico.
The EU needs Ukraine to protect it. No one understands war better than Ukrainians do. No other country in the European community has such modern military experience. Ukraine's battle-hardened military could become an alternative to the US Army, which currently has over 65,000 troops in the EU.
It's true that Europe is not yet ready to take this path. Europeans have a problem, or rather, a shortcoming. The United States currently has military technologies that we haven't even been able to match in Europe. I'm thinking, for example, of their surveillance capabilities, electronic warfare, their strategic bombers. Europe has no indigenous alternatives to all this, and that is precisely what we need to start solving right now. But watch out, because it's not only military issues that need to be resolved. To begin with, this war has made one thing crystal clear. Europe can never again depend on Russia. Because yes, Gazprom's cheap gas was a boon for the European economy, but in the end, it ended up becoming a trap.
Since the outbreak of the conflict, the EU has progressively severed its energy ties with Moscow, and the change has been brutal. Before the invasion, 45% of Europe's gas imports came from Russia. Today, that figure has plummeted to 15%. The dilemma will be what happens once the war is over, and with the passage of time, some things become normalized with Russia.
Now, there is a risk that some European countries, especially those in economic crisis such as Germany, will be tempted to increase purchases of cheap Russian gas again. And that is exactly what must be avoided, because preventing it would be much more important for the security of Europe and Ukraine than deploying 30,000 European troops in Ukraine that Ukraine, numerically, does not need. And with economic and financial sanctions, it's a very similar story. There's a real risk that Europe, especially in a difficult economic context, may be tempted to throw itself back into Russia's arms in some areas. Well, let's be clear. We have to look for alternatives that don't finance Russia, such as strengthening the nuclear industry and building new power plants to become energy independent. Be that as it may, what is clear is that Europe can no longer entrust its security to the United States. The reality check that was needed was to see Washington shamelessly blackmailing the president of a country invaded by a bigger and stronger country. To see the supposed leader of the free world buying all the Kremlin's arguments and propaganda and lying about data, figures, and facts without any modesty whatsoever. To see a US administration that prefers to call Zelenskyy a dictator and publicly humiliate him while having only good words for Vladimir Putin. VisualPolitik community, there's no need for European troops in Ukraine. The Ukrainians only need Europe to be back, militarily and economically. And that is going to be the difficult task ahead of them in the European capitals, and also within the Union. Will they be up to the task? Time will tell. In the meantime, the questions are for you. What do you think about the US blackmailing Ukraine with the suspension of all military aid? What lessons should Europe and also Ukraine take from all this? Do you think Kyiv really needs European soldiers on its territory to ensure its security? Well, leave us your opinions below in the comments, and let's start a debate. And now, if you like this video, please like and subscribe to VisualPolitik if you haven't already done so. As always, thanks for watching, all the best, see you next time.